The Salt in Everything. Chapter 1, The Weight of Morning Light. Arthur Pemberton woke at 6:30, as he had every morning for the past 4 years since retirement, though his body no longer needed the alarm clock that sat silent on Eleanor's old nightstand. The light filtering through the gauze curtains carried the particular quality of October on the Maine coast, thin and silver, like old photographs left too long in the sun. He lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds that had become his morning liturgy, the distant crash of waves against Gull Point, the creak of his own house settling into another day, and sometimes, if he was lucky, the faint sound of music drifting from the blue cottage next door where Iris Chen painted with her windows thrown wide open, even in the chill. "She's awake early today," he thought, recognizing the melancholy notes of a Chopin nocturne. Iris played piano the way she did everything else, with an intensity that seemed to pull color from the very air around her. He had watched her hands move across the keys through her kitchen window once, quite by accident while watering his tomatoes, and had been struck by the delicate strength in her fingers, the way she seemed to be having a conversation with the music itself. Arthur pushed himself upright, his joints offering their customary morning protest. 67 years had settled into his bones like sediment, not unpleasantly, but with a weight that reminded him daily of time's persistent current. In the mirror across the room, he caught sight of himself, hair the color of sea foam, shoulders that had begun their slow surrender to gravity, eyes that Eleanor used to say held the patience of someone who had spent 40 years helping people find the right book. "You look like someone who knows where all the secrets are hidden," she had told him once, running her finger along the spine of a volume of Neruda he'd been cataloguing. That was 32 years ago, back when the library still smelled of card catalogues and rubber stamps, when he believed he had all the time in the world to learn the geography of her laughter. Now the library had been converted into a community center, and Eleanor had been gone for 3 years, and Arthur found himself thinking more and more about secrets, particularly the one he carried like a smooth stone in his chest whenever he saw Iris painting in her garden, her dark hair caught up in a paint-stained bandana, her face alive with concentration. He dressed carefully, as had become his habit. Pressed khakis, a button-down shirt the color of faded denim, a cardigan that Eleanor had knitted him the winter before her diagnosis. The routine was armor, in its way, a daily assertion that he was still a man who took care with his appearance, who had not surrendered entirely to the shapelessness that seemed to claim so many men his age. In the kitchen, he made coffee in the French press Eleanor had brought back from their trip to Montreal, measuring the grounds with the precision of someone who found comfort in small rituals. Through the window above the sink, he could see Iris's easel set up on her back deck, though she wasn't there yet. A canvas was propped against it, half-finished, something blue and wild that might have been the sea or the sky or the space between longing and contentment. "She sees things I've forgotten how to see," he thought, and immediately felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with thoughts of Iris. It was a particular kind of ache, different from grief, though he had become expert at cataloguing such distinctions. Grief was the hollow place Eleanor had left behind, vast and echoing. This other feeling was smaller, but somehow more urgent, a persistent brightness, like having a shard of sunlight lodged beneath his ribs. The coffee was ready. Arthur poured himself a mug and added a careful teaspoon of honey, another of his small ceremonies. Outside, the morning light was strengthening, and he could hear Iris moving around in her kitchen, the soft percussion of breakfast being made. Sometimes she hummed while she cooked, melodies he half recognized, and he would find himself holding his breath to catch the notes. He had not spoken to another soul about this feeling that had taken root in him sometime during the 2nd year of their acquaintance. To speak of it would be to make it real in a way that terrified him, not because he was ashamed, but because it might require him to acknowledge what could never be. Iris was kind to him, genuinely fond, he thought. She brought him vegetables from her garden and asked his advice about books. She had cried at Eleanor's funeral and held his hand during the reception afterward, her fingers warm and paint-stained and smelling faintly of turpentine. But she was 50 to his 67, alive with creative energy and possessed of a vitality that drew people to her like moths to flame. He had seen the way younger men looked at her at the farmer's market, the way she laughed with them, easy and unguarded. Arthur was her neighbor, her friend, the widower next door, who helped her carry her heavy canvases and listened with patient attention when she talked about color theory and negative space. The coffee was good, dark and bitter with just enough sweetness. Arthur stood at his kitchen window and watched the day gather itself, and tried not to think about the fact that Iris would be leaving for Boston in 2 weeks for a gallery showing, her first solo exhibition. She had told him about it 3 days ago, practically glowing with excitement and nervousness, and he had congratulated her with genuine pleasure even as something inside him had quietly broken. 2 weeks, he thought. And then what? If the show went well, if her work found an audience, would she stay in Boston? Would she return to Millbrook Harbor changed, full of new possibilities that had nothing to do with quiet coastal towns, or aging librarians who read too much poetry and knew the Latin names for every flower in his carefully tended garden? He had learned, in his years with Eleanor and in the sharp education of losing her, that love was not always about having. Sometimes it was about witnessing, about being present for someone else's blooming even when that blooming took them away from you. But knowing this and feeling peaceful about it were two different things entirely. Arthur finished his coffee and rinsed the mug, then walked to his front door to collect the morning paper. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, carrying the salt-sweet smell of seaweed and the faint scent of wood smoke from someone's chimney. As he bent to pick up the paper, he heard Iris's screen door open and turned to see her stepping onto her porch with her own coffee mug, wrapped in a paint-splattered robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Morning, Arthur," she called, lifting her mug in greeting. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Beautiful indeed," he replied, and meant it in more ways than she could know. "How's the painting going?" "Oh, you know. Some days I feel like I'm capturing something true, other days I feel like I'm just pushing pigment around." She laughed, that particular laugh that reminded him of water running over stones. "Today feels like a pushing pigment around day, but maybe that'll change once I've had enough caffeine." She was beautiful in the morning light, he realized, not in the conventional way, perhaps, but in the way that came from being fully alive to the world. Her face was animated with the particular energy of someone who had found her calling, who woke up each day eager to translate what she saw into something others could see too. "I'm sure inspiration will strike," Arthur said, and immediately felt foolish for the banality of the comment. But Iris smiled at him with genuine warmth. "You always know just what to say," she said. "I don't know what I'd do without your steady confidence in me." Steady confidence. The phrase lodged in his chest like a small, bright blade. It was not unpleasant, exactly, but it carried a weight of definition that made him suddenly aware of how she saw him: reliable, encouraging, safe. The neighbor who could be counted on for measured optimism and quiet support. "Have a good day, Arthur," Iris said, already turning back toward her door, her mind clearly moving toward the canvas that waited for her. "Maybe I'll see you this evening. I'm thinking about taking a walk down to the harbor if the light holds." "I'd like that very much," he said, but she had already gone inside, leaving only the faint scent of coffee and the lingering sense of a moment past. unremarkable and precious. Arthur stood on his porch for a long moment, the newspaper forgotten in his hand, watching the place where Iris had been. This was his life now, these brief encounters, these careful conversations, these moments of seeing her fully alive and knowing that her aliveness had nothing to do with him. It was, he had come to understand, its own kind of love, the love of witness, of appreciation without possession. But knowledge did not make it hurt less. Knowledge, in fact, sometimes made it hurt more. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Solitude. The Millbrook Harbour Public Library had been Arthur's second home for 4 decades, and even now, 3 years into retirement, he found himself drawn back to its quiet corners like a compass needle finding true north. The building had been transformed into a community centre, but the bones of it remained the same: high ceilings that caught and held whispers, tall windows that framed the harbour like moving paintings, the ghost scent of thousands of books that had once lived here. On Thursday mornings, Arthur volunteered to teach a literacy class for adults, mostly fishermen and seasonal workers whose education had been interrupted by the practical demands of making a living. It was work that required patience and gentleness, qualities he had spent 40 years cultivating in the quiet spaces between stacks. Today, Miguel Santos was struggling with a passage from Of Mice and Men, his weathered fingers tracing under each word as if he could coax meaning from the page through touch alone. Miguel was 53, had been hauling lobster traps since he was 14, and had decided 2 years ago that he wanted to be able to read the stories his granddaughter brought home from school. But not us. And why? Because I got you to look after me, and you got me to look after you, Miguel read slowly, his voice catching slightly on the rhythm of Steinbeck's dialogue. Arthur nodded encouragingly. That's excellent, Miguel. You can hear the friendship in those words, can't you? The way George and Lenny belong to each other. Miguel looked up from the book, his dark eyes thoughtful. It's about not being alone, isn't it? Having somebody who knows you. Yes, Arthur said quietly. Exactly that. The simple truth of it, the human need for witness, for someone who knows your story, settled in the space between them. Arthur found himself thinking, as he often did, about the particular loneliness of widowhood. It wasn't just the absence of Eleanor that haunted him, though that was certainly part of it. It was the loss of being fully known, of having someone who remembered the small details of your days and carried the accumulated weight of your shared history. With Eleanor, he had been the subject of someone else's attention in ways both profound and mundane. She knew that he preferred his coffee strong and his toast barely golden, that he read poetry before bed and dreamed in images rather than words. She knew that he hummed unconsciously when he was content and fell silent when he was working through a problem. She had been the keeper of his smaller selves, the witness to his daily transformations. Now there were things about Arthur that only he remembered, the way he had felt reading Leaves of Grass for the first time, the precise quality of light in the old library on winter afternoons, the sound Eleanor made when she laughed at something that had surprised her. These memories had no external validation, no one to confirm or contradict them. They existed in the solitary space of his own consciousness, growing more precious and more fragile with each passing day. Mr. Arthur. Miguel's voice drew him back to the present. You okay? You looked far away. Just thinking, Arthur said, offering a reassuring smile. About stories, and how they help us make sense of things. Should we continue? They worked through another page together. Miguel's confidence growing with each successfully navigated sentence. Arthur found a particular satisfaction in this work, in the way literacy opened doors that had previously been closed. There was something miraculous about the moment when letters became words, became meaning, when the symbolic transformed into the real. After the class ended and Miguel had left with his homework assignment, to read the next chapter, and write 3 sentences, about what he thought would happen to George and Lenny, Arthur lingered in the community center's main room. The space held echoes of its former life. The circulation desk had been converted into an information center, but he could still see the ghost marks on the floor where the card catalogs had stood. Sometimes he imagined he could hear the whisper of pages turning, the soft stamp of due dates, the hushed conversations that had been the soundtrack of his working life. "Arthur? I thought I might find you here." He turned to find Iris in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through the harbor-facing windows. She wore a paint-stained canvas jacket over dark jeans, her hair caught up in a messy bun secured with what appeared to be a paintbrush. She looked, as always, like someone in the middle of creating something beautiful. "Iris," he said, and was pleased that his voice sounded normal, friendly but not overly eager. "What brings you to the old library?" "I was hoping to find you, actually." She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the transformed space with the particular attention of someone who saw in visual terms. "I have a favor to ask, and also, well, maybe just an excuse to see a friendly face." Arthur's pulse quickened slightly, though he kept his expression neutral. "What can I do for you?" "I'm having a panic attack about Boston," she said with a rueful laugh, settling into one of the chairs arranged in a circle for community meetings. "Not a literal panic attack, but, you know, the kind where your brain starts cataloging all the ways things could go wrong and won't shut up about it." Arthur took the chair across from her, noting the way she twisted her silver ring, a nervous gesture he had observed before. "What's your brain telling you?" "That I'm not ready. That my work isn't good enough. That I'll stand there in some fancy gallery next to my paintings and everyone will see immediately that I'm just, I don't know, a small-town amateur who got lucky." She shook her head. "Ridiculous, right? I've been working toward this for years." Arthur studied her face, seeing past the surface confidence to the vulnerability beneath. It was one of the things he loved about her, the way she could be simultaneously strong and uncertain, accomplished and still reaching. "May I tell you what I see when I look at your work?" She nodded, suddenly very still. "I see someone who understands that color has emotional weight. I see landscapes that aren't just representations of places, but translations of feeling. That painting you did of the harbor in winter, the one with all those grays and blues. I stood in front of it for 20 minutes, because it captured something I'd never been able to put into words about what it feels like to live beside the ocean." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Your work has what great art has always had, the ability to make someone else's inner world visible." Iris was quiet for a long moment, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears. "You really see all that?" "I really do." And he did. Arthur's appreciation for her art was entirely genuine, untainted by his other feelings for her. If anything, his love for Iris had taught him to look more carefully at her paintings, to see the intelligence and sensitivity that informed every brushstroke. "This is why I needed to find you," she said softly. "You have this way of steadying me, of reminding me who I am when I start to forget." Steadying. There was that word again, carrying its particular weight. Arthur felt the familiar mixture of gratitude and melancholy that came with being cast in the role of steady presence, reliable friend, the person others turned to for reassurance and wisdom. It was not an unimportant role, he knew that, valued it even. But it was also a role that, by definition, kept him at a certain safe distance from the more turbulent emotions, the messier intimacies that existed at the heart of things. "I'm glad I can be that for you," he said, and meant it despite the complexity of his feelings. "The favor I mentioned," Iris continued, "is this: would you consider coming to Boston with me? Just for the opening night. I know it's a lot to ask, and I know you don't really like cities, but I think I'd be braver with you there. You could be my moral support, my representative of real life in a room full of art world people." Arthur felt his heart perform an intricate dance, a leap of joy at being asked, followed immediately by the recognition of all the ways this could be complicated for him. Spending an evening watching Iris in her element, seeing her work celebrated, standing beside her as her friend while feeling what he felt. It would be both wonderful and excruciating. But looking at her face, seeing the genuine hope and nervousness there, he knew there was only one answer he could give. "I would be honored," he said simply. The smile that broke across her face was like sunrise on water. "Really? You'll come? Really?" She leaned forward and took his hand briefly, a quick squeeze of gratitude that sent warmth up his arm. "Thank you, Arthur. You're just the best. The best." Another phrase to add to his collection: steady, reliable, the best. All true, all meant with genuine affection, all carrying the particular ache of being loved in ways that fell just short of what his heart wanted most. After Iris left to return to her painting, Arthur sat alone in the transformed library and thought about the architecture of solitude. There was the obvious kind, the empty house, the meals for one, the conversations conducted only with oneself. But there was also the more complex kind, the solitude of being seen but not fully known, of being appreciated for qualities that were real but not complete, of loving someone who loved you back, but in a different key entirely. He thought about Miguel, working so patiently to decode the symbols that would connect him more deeply to his granddaughter's world. He thought about George and Lenny, carrying their dream of companionship across a landscape that seemed designed to keep people separate. He thought about Iris, brave enough to put her inner vision into the world but frightened of what that vulnerability might cost her. Everyone, Arthur realized, was trying to bridge some form of distance between themselves and others, between their inner worlds and external reality, between what they hoped for and what they had. He was no different, no more isolated in his longing than anyone else. The specifics varied, but the fundamental human condition was the same. We were all reaching across space toward connection, toward understanding, toward the comfort of being truly seen. It didn't make his particular loneliness hurt less, exactly. But it placed it in a larger context, made it part of something universal rather than evidence of his own failure or inadequacy. And there was, Arthur thought, a strange comfort in that. Chapter 3: The Color of Leaving. The morning of Iris's departure for Boston dawned grey and restless, with the kind of October wind that stripped the last stubborn leaves from the maples and sent them dancing across Arthur's carefully raked lawn. He stood at his kitchen window with his second cup of coffee, watching Iris load her Honda Civic with what appeared to be half the contents of her studio. She had been up since 5, he knew, because the lights in her cottage had been blazing when he woke. Through the thin walls that separated their properties, he had heard the muffled sounds of her preparation, footsteps on hardwood floors, the careful clink of brushes and palette knives being packed, the occasional soft curse when something didn't fit as expected. Arthur had dressed with particular care this morning, choosing a charcoal wool blazer he'd bought for Eleanor's cousin's wedding 5 years ago, and rarely worn since. The Boston Gallery opening was still 3 days away. But Iris wanted to arrive early to oversee the hanging of her paintings and acclimate herself to the city. Arthur would follow on Friday morning, taking the train from Portland and meeting her at the gallery for what she had described as the most terrifying and wonderful evening of my life. Now, watching her wrestle a large canvas into her backseat, Arthur felt the peculiar emptiness that preceded any goodbye, even temporary ones. For 2 years, Iris's presence next door had become part of the rhythm of his days. Her morning music, the smell of turpentine that drifted from her open studio windows, the warm glow of her lights in the evening, these had been the subtle but constant reminders that life, in all its creative urgency, was happening just beyond his garden fence. He set down his coffee mug and walked outside, ostensibly to retrieve his newspaper, but really to be available if she needed help. The October air bit at his face, carrying the salt-sweet scent of low tide and the smoke from someone's chimney. Iris looked up from her packing and gave him a wave that was half greeting, half plea for assistance. "Arthur." "Perfect timing. I'm trying to fit everything in, but I think I've overestimated the cargo capacity of a Honda Civic." "Moving to Boston permanently?" he asked with a smile, though something in his chest tightened at his own joke. "Ha! Very funny." But she was grinning, and he could see the nervous energy sparking in her eyes, the barely contained excitement that made her gestures quicker and more animated than usual. "I know I'm overpacking, but what if I need the cerulean blue? What if I want to work on something while I'm there? What if you trust yourself to have everything you need?" Arthur interrupted gently, recognizing the spiral of pre-travel anxiety he had seen in library patrons preparing for research trips or students heading off to college. "You've been preparing for this for months, Iris. You're ready." She stopped rearranging canvases and looked at him directly. "You really think so?" "I know so." And he did. Arthur had watched Iris work, had seen the careful attention she paid to every detail of color and composition. Her paintings were not accidents of inspiration, but the products of disciplined observation and hard-won skill. Whatever happened in Boston, she would represent herself well. "Okay," she said, taking a deep breath. "You're right. I'm just. God, Arthur, what if they hate everything? What if no one comes? What if they love it? What if people see what I see when I look at your work, that you have something genuine and beautiful to offer the world?" Iris stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell her shampoo and see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. For a moment, Arthur thought she might hug him, and he prepared himself for the sweet torture of her brief embrace. Instead, she reached out and straightened his collar, a gesture so natural and intimate that it nearly undid him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For believing in me. For agreeing to come to Boston. For being you. For being me." Arthur wondered if she had any idea how complicated that simple phrase was, how much of himself he kept carefully hidden whenever they were together. But he smiled and nodded, accepting the compliment for what it was, genuine appreciation for the version of himself he allowed her to see. "You should get going," he said. "The traffic getting out of Portland can be brutal, and you'll want time to settle in before you have to think about galleries and art critics. Right?" "Yes." "Going?" But she lingered for another moment, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I'll call you tonight, okay? Let you know I made it safely." "I'd like that." She did hug him then, a quick, fierce embrace that smelled of coffee and determination. Arthur allowed himself to close his eyes for the brief duration of it, to memorize the weight of her arms around his shoulders and the way she fit against his chest. Then she stepped back, already turning toward the driver's side of her car. "See you Friday, Arthur. At the gallery. 7 o'clock sharp. I'll be there." He stood in his driveway and watched her car disappear around the bend toward Route 1. Then continued standing there long after the sound of her engine had faded. The morning suddenly felt larger and emptier, like a house with too many rooms. Even the wind seemed quieter without Iris's presence to animate it. Arthur retrieved his newspaper and walked slowly back to his house, already calculating the hours until Friday evening. 72 hours. He could manage 72 hours. Inside, he made himself a piece of toast he didn't particularly want and tried to focus on the day's crossword puzzle. 7 across, temporary separation 9 letters. He filled an interlude without thinking, then stared at the word and felt its accuracy like a small, sharp stone in his shoe. That evening, as promised, Iris called. Arthur was in his study, half-heartedly reading a biography of Willa Cather he'd been meaning to get to for months, when the phone rang. "Arthur? I made it. I'm here, I'm in Boston, I'm in my hotel room overlooking the Common, and I think I might throw up from excitement." Her voice was bright with nervous energy, and Arthur could picture her pacing as she talked, probably gesturing to emphasize points he couldn't see. The image made him smile. "How was the drive?" "Long but good. I listened to that podcast you recommended, the one about the history of color in painting. Fascinating stuff. Did you know that the invention of portable paint tubes in the 1840s basically made Impressionism possible? All those plein air painters working directly from nature, it never could have happened if they'd had to mix their pigments on site." Arthur did know this, had in fact recommended the podcast specifically because he thought she'd find that episode interesting. But he let her tell him about it anyway, enjoying the enthusiasm in her voice, the way her mind made connections between seemingly disparate ideas. "Have you seen the gallery yet?" "I walked by it this afternoon, but it was closed." "Arthur, it's beautiful. Really elegant, in this restored brownstone in the South End. There's a little cafe next door, and trees lining the street, and I could see some of my paintings through the window." She trailed off. It felt surreal. Like I was looking at someone else's life. "But it's your life," Arthur said gently. "Your work, your vision, your moment. I keep forgetting that. Thank you for reminding me." They talked for another 20 minutes about practical things, the hotel, her plans for tomorrow, the train schedule Arthur should follow on Friday. But underneath the logistics, Arthur could hear something else in her voice. A note of loneliness, perhaps, or simply the disorientation that came with being in an unfamiliar place pursuing a long-held dream. "Arthur," she said as their conversation was winding down, "I'm really glad you're coming Friday. I know I've said this before, but you make me feel braver. More like myself. You are brave, Iris. And you're always yourself." "Not always. Sometimes I feel like I'm playing a part, the confident artist, the woman who has it all figured out. But with you, I don't have to perform. I can just be uncertain sometimes. Scared sometimes. Human." Arthur closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her trust and the particular poignancy of being seen as a safe harbor. Being human is not a failing. "I know. Intellectually, I know. But it's nice to have someone remind me." After she hung up, Arthur sat in his study for a long time, the Cather biography forgotten in his lap. Through the window, he could see Iris's cottage, dark now except for the automatic porch light that would burn until dawn. The absence of her lighted windows made the evening feel incomplete, like a song missing its melody line. He thought about what she had said, that he made her feel brave, that with him she could be uncertain and scared and human. It was a beautiful thing to be told, and also a devastating one. Because what it meant, translated into the language of his secret heart, was that he was the person she turned to when she needed to feel safe, not the person who made her feel electric with possibility. He was the steady ground beneath her feet, not the wind that lifted her toward flight. Arthur understood, with the particular clarity that comes in moments of solitude, that this was likely how it would always be between them. He would be her friend, her supporter, her reliable presence. She would share her triumphs and fears with him, trust him with her vulnerabilities, value his steady affection. And he would love her from this careful distance, grateful for what she offered while mourning what remained forever out of reach. It was not a small thing, he reminded himself, to be trusted with someone's uncertainties. It was not meaningless to be the person another turned to for reassurance and wisdom. But it was also not enough, would never be enough, to quiet the particular longing that had taken up residence in his chest like a bird that had forgotten how to migrate. 70 hours now until he would see her again. Arthur marked the time in his mind and tried not to think about what would happen after Friday, when Iris returned to Millbrook Harbour changed by success or failure, carrying new experiences that had nothing to do with him. For now, there was only the anticipation of being in the same room with her again, of watching her face as strangers encountered her work for the first time, of playing his small, but necessary role in her moment of triumph. It would have to be enough. For now, it would have to be everything. Chapter 4, Gallery Light. The train from Portland to Boston gave Arthur 2.5 hours to consider his reflection in the window, as the October landscape flashed by in auburn and gold. He had chosen his clothes carefully that morning, his best navy suit, a tie Eleanor had given him for Christmas 3 years ago, leather shoes he'd polished until they gleamed like dark water. Looking at himself in the train's window, he saw a man dressed for an occasion, someone who understood that appearances mattered when you were representing not just yourself, but your faith in another person's dreams. Beside him, a woman in her 30s was reading a thick novel, occasionally glancing up to watch the countryside. Across the aisle, a businessman typed rapidly on his laptop, pausing every few minutes to check his phone. Arthur envied them their obvious destinations, their clear purposes. His own mission felt more complex. To be present for Iris's opening without letting his private feelings contaminate her evening, to celebrate her success while maintaining the careful emotional distance that friendship required. The gallery opening was at 7. Arthur had arranged to meet Iris at 6:30, giving them a few minutes together before the crowd arrived. In his jacket pocket, he carried a small wrapped package, a first-edition copy of Letters to a Young Poet he'd found at a rare book dealer in Camden. It seemed appropriate, Rilke's advice to trust in difficult things, to be patient with all that was unsolved in the heart. Boston South Station enveloped him in its familiar chaos of announcements and hurrying travelers. Arthur had not been to the city in over a year, and he had forgotten the particular energy of urban spaces, the way they seemed to accelerate time and compress distance, making every interaction feel both more urgent and more anonymous than those in small towns. The gallery was a 20-minute walk from the station, and Arthur arrived with time to spare. The Meridian Gallery occupied the ground floor of a restored Victorian brownstone, its large windows offering glimpses of white walls and carefully arranged lighting. Even from the street, Arthur could see several of Iris's paintings. The winter harbour scene he had mentioned to her, a study of storm clouds over Gull Point, a smaller canvas that captured the particular quality of light that fell across the town cemetery on summer afternoons. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling an unexpected swell of pride. These were Iris's visions made manifest, her private seeing transformed into something others could share. Whatever his personal feelings, whatever complications existed in his heart, this moment was unambiguously good. A talented person's work finding its way into the world. Arthur. You came. He turned to find Iris approaching from the cafe next door. And his first thought was that she looked like someone who belonged in cities. She wore a black dress he had never seen before, elegant and simple, with a necklace of silver and turquoise that caught the late afternoon light. Her hair was arranged in a way that seemed both effortless and sophisticated, and she moved with the particular confidence of someone who was exactly where they were supposed to be. You look beautiful, he said, and immediately felt the inadequacy of the words. She looked more than beautiful, she looked alive in a way that made the street around them seem more vivid, as if her presence had adjusted the saturation of everything else. You clean up pretty well yourself, she said, reaching out to adjust his tie with a familiarity that sent warmth through his chest. How was the train ride? Peaceful. It gave me time to think about how proud I am of you. Iris's smile was radiant. Come inside. I want to show you everything before the crowd arrives and I lose my mind completely. The gallery's interior was exactly what Arthur had expected, spare and elegant, with white walls and polished concrete floors that reflected the carefully positioned track lighting. But the paintings, Iris's paintings, transformed the space into something alive and immediate. Her landscapes seemed to pulse with their own internal weather. Her harbour scenes captured not just the visual reality of coastal Maine, but its emotional temperature as well. My God, Iris, Arthur said softly. Seeing them all together like this. Different than in my studio, right? The gallery director, her name is Claire, she has this amazing eye for how to arrange things. She said my work has what she called emotional architecture, that each painting creates its own space, but they also speak to each other. Arthur moved slowly through the gallery, taking in individual canvases, while also absorbing the cumulative effect of Iris's vision. There was the autumn marsh painting that made him think of Dickinson's line about the landscape listening. There was her interpretation of the fog rolling in from the Atlantic, grey and white and silver blue like layers of memory. And there, in the place of honor opposite the entrance, was a painting he had never seen before. A view of Millbrook Harbour from the cemetery hill, painted in the golden light of late afternoon, with a figure in the foreground whose face was turned away from the viewer. The figure was clearly a man, solitary and contemplative, standing among the weathered headstones with his hands clasped behind his back. Something about the posture, the way the afternoon light caught the shoulders of his dark jacket, made Arthur's breath catch in his throat. That one's new, Iris said, appearing beside him. I finished it just last week. I call it Meditation Among the Stones. She paused, and Arthur could feel her watching his reaction. There's something about that cemetery hill, the way it overlooks the harbour, the way the light falls there in the afternoon. I've walked past it hundreds of times, but one day I saw this figure there, and I thought about how we carry our stories with us, even in places dedicated to endings. Arthur stared at the painting, recognition blooming slowly in his chest. The figure's posture, the careful attention to the way late light caught the fabric of his jacket, the particular angle of contemplation, it was unmistakably him. Not a portrait, exactly, but a capturing of essence, of a moment when he had thought himself unobserved. I hope you don't mind, Iris continued, her voice suddenly uncertain. I painted it from memory, from seeing you there one afternoon when I was coming back from the harbor. You looked so peaceful, I guess. Like you belonged there, like you were having a conversation with the place itself. You painted me, Arthur said softly, still staring at the canvas. I painted a moment that moved me. You just happened to be the subject. But there was something in her voice, a particular gentleness, that suggested the moment had meant more to her than she was saying. Arthur felt exposed and honored simultaneously, the strange vulnerability of discovering that someone had seen him when he thought he was alone, had found something in that seeing worth preserving. It's beautiful, he said finally. I'm moved that you saw something worth painting. Arthur. Iris touched his arm lightly. You're one of the most paintable people I know. You have this quality of stillness that isn't empty, it's full. Like you're always listening to something the rest of us are too busy to hear. Before Arthur could respond, the gallery's front door opened and a woman in her 50s entered, followed by a couple Arthur didn't recognize. Claire, presumably, and the first of the evening's guests. Iris straightened, her public persona sliding smoothly into place. Showtime, she murmured to Arthur, then moved forward to greet the gallery director with the confident smile of someone who had spent the afternoon practicing this moment in her mind. Arthur stepped back, content to observe as Iris transformed into the version of herself the evening required. She was gracious with strangers, articulate about her work without being pretentious, genuinely interested in what people saw when they looked at her paintings. He watched her field questions about technique and inspiration, watched her face light up when someone made a connection she hadn't expected. The gallery filled slowly with the particular mix of people who attended art openings: serious collectors with careful eyes, other artists who studied the work with professional interest, art enthusiasts who moved from painting to painting with wine glasses in hand, making the soft appreciative sounds that gallery openings required. Arthur recognized the type from Eleanor's book clubs and library fundraisers, people who understood that culture required witnesses, that someone had to show up and pay attention for art to complete its journey from private vision to public experience. You must be Arthur. He turned to find an elegant woman in her 60s approaching with 2 wine glasses. She had silver hair cut in a sharp bob, and wore a black dress that probably cost more than Arthur spent on clothes in a year. Claire Meridian, she said, offering him one of the glasses. Iris has told me so much about you. She says you're the reason she had the confidence to pursue this showing. I think you're giving me too much credit, Arthur said, accepting the wine gratefully. Iris's talent speaks for itself. Talent, yes. But talent without support is just private suffering. She's lucky to have someone who believes in her work so completely. Claire paused, studying his face with the assessing look of someone accustomed to reading people quickly. Are you a collector? Retired librarian, Arthur said. I'm just here as a friend. The best kind of art patron, Claire said with a smile. Someone who loves the work for what it is, not what it might be worth. She gestured toward the painting of the cemetery. That one's already sold, you know. A collector from New York saw it this afternoon and bought it immediately. Said it reminded him of Andrew Wyeth, but with more emotional complexity. Arthur felt an unexpected pang of loss. The painting would leave, travel to some stranger's wall, become part of a collection rather than a conversation between artist and subject. But wasn't that what success meant? That Iris's work would find its way into the world, would continue to exist long after this evening ended. I'm glad, he said, and mostly meant it. The evening continued around him in waves of conversation and careful observation. Arthur found himself in several discussions about coastal Maine, about the challenges of capturing natural light, about the way good regional art transcended its immediate geographical boundaries. He was surprised to discover that people were genuinely interested in his perspective as someone who lived in Iris's landscape, who could verify the emotional accuracy of her interpretations. "You can see she really knows this place," a woman from Boston told him, as they stood in front of the Winter Harbor scene. "It's not just pretty, it has weight to it, like she's painting the feeling of living somewhere, not just visiting it." "She has deep roots there," Arthur agreed. "She paints what she loves." Near 9 o'clock, as the crowd was beginning to thin, Iris found him standing in front of a smaller canvas, her study of morning light on the tidal pools near Gull Point. She looked radiant and exhausted, exhilarated by success, but drained by the energy it had taken to be on for 3 hours. "How are you holding up?" Arthur asked. "I can't believe it," she said, leaning against him briefly, a gesture of familiarity that would have seemed natural to any observer, but sent complicated waves of warmth through Arthur's chest. "People actually understand what I'm trying to do. And they want to take pieces home with them. Claire says this is one of the most successful openings she's had this year." "I'm not surprised. Your work deserves this recognition." "I couldn't have done it without you," Iris said, looking up at him with an expression of such genuine gratitude that Arthur had to look away. "Not just tonight, but all of it. Having someone who believed in me when I didn't always believe in myself, that made the difference." Arthur felt the familiar mixture of joy and melancholy that came with being appreciated for the parts of himself he could safely offer. "You would have found your way here with or without me. Maybe it would have taken a little longer, but your talent was always going to find its audience. Maybe. But it means everything to me that you're here tonight. That you got to see this." She gestured toward the gallery, toward the small clusters of people still examining her work. "This is what it looks like when a dream comes true, and I wanted you to witness it." Witness. There was that word again, carrying all the weight of being seen and appreciated and carefully held at the proper distance. Arthur was Iris's witness, her steady presence, her representative of the life she was expanding beyond. It was an important role, he knew that, valued it even. But it was also a finite one, bounded by the limits of friendship and the careful architecture of what could be safely felt. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last few visitors move through the gallery space. Arthur allowed himself to memorize the moment, Iris beside him, tired but triumphant, her paintings glowing under the gallery's precise lighting, the soft murmur of conversations about color and composition and the ineffable qualities that made art matter. This was her night, her achievement, and he was grateful to have been included in it. But he was also aware, with the particular clarity that comes in moments of heightened emotion, that something was ending as well as beginning. Tonight marked Iris's emergence into a larger world, one that would likely call her away from Millbrook Harbor with increasing frequency. She would have other openings, other successes, new relationships with people who shared her professional ambitions and artistic vocabularies. Her life would expand in ways that had nothing to do with quiet coastal towns or retired librarians who helped carry her canvases and listen patiently to her theories about light. "Arthur?" Iris's voice drew him back to the present. "You look far away again." "Just taking it all in," he said. "This is a night worth remembering." She smiled at him with the particular warmth reserved for people who had shown up when showing up mattered. "Come on," she said. "Let me buy you dinner. I know a place." And so they walked through the Boston evening together, leaving the gallery behind them like a bright doorway into Iris's expanding future. Arthur matched his pace to hers, grateful for these additional hours in her company, already calculating how long the train ride home would take tomorrow, and how many days would pass before he saw her again. Some kinds of love, he had learned, were best measured not in possession or proximity, but in the quality of attention offered, the faithfulness of witness maintained. Tonight, he had been exactly where Iris needed him to be. Tomorrow, he would return to his quiet life and wait patiently for whatever small part he might play in her next chapter. It was not everything he wanted. But it was not nothing, either. Chapter 5: The Return. Arthur's train pulled into Portland just after noon on Saturday, carrying him back toward Millbrook Harbor with the peculiar disorientation that follows any journey away from familiar routines. The October landscape looked different now, more golden, perhaps, or maybe it was his eyes that had changed after seeing Iris's interpretations of these same colors hung in gallery light, validated by strangers who had never walked these roads or breathed this salt-touched air. Boston had been a success in every measurable way. 8 paintings sold, including the cemetery scene that had captured Arthur in a moment of solitary contemplation. Business cards exchanged with collectors and other gallery owners. An interview scheduled with Art New England magazine. Iris had been luminous with accomplishment, her confidence growing throughout the evening as she realized that her private visions had found their audience. They had eaten dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the North End, sitting across from each other at a corner table while Iris replayed the evening's conversations, and Arthur listened with the particular attention he had always given to people describing moments of transformation. She talked about the collector, who had bought 3 paintings, about Claire's suggestion that she consider a show in New York, about the way it felt to stand next to her work and hear strangers discuss what they saw there. "It's like they are seeing parts of me I didn't know I was revealing," she had said over tiramisu and coffee. This one woman stood in front of the fog painting for 10 minutes, and when she finally spoke, she said it reminded her of her father, who was a fisherman. She said I had captured something about the relationship between people and the sea that she'd never seen in art before. Arthur had nodded, recognizing the particular magic that happens when art bridges the gap between one person's experience and another's recognition. It was what he had always loved about literature, the way a well-chosen word or phrase could make readers feel less alone in their private thoughts, more connected to the larger human conversation. Now, riding the local bus from Portland to Millbrook Harbor, Arthur watched the familiar landscape reassemble itself around him, the weathered barns and rocky pastures, the glimpses of harbor visible between stands of pine, the gradual transition from somewhere else back to home. By the time he reached his own street, the October afternoon was waning toward evening, and he could see lights beginning to come on in windows up and down the block. Iris's cottage was dark, of course. She had planned to stay in Boston through Sunday, to have what she called a proper victory lap, before returning to the demands of normal life. Arthur let himself into his own house, and was immediately struck by the quality of silence that greeted him, not the comfortable quiet he usually associated with coming home, but something heavier, more complete. After the energy of the gallery opening, the careful conversations with strangers, the pleasure of seeing Iris in her element, his house felt almost aggressively peaceful. He made himself a cup of tea and sat in his kitchen, looking out at Iris's darkened cottage, and thinking about the painting that would soon hang in some stranger's home in New York. The collector had introduced himself as Marcus Webb, a man in his 70s who collected what he called contemporary American realism with emotional depth. He had studied Arthur's painted figure for a long time before making his decision to purchase. "There's something about the solitude in this piece," Webb had told Iris. "It's not lonely solitude, it's chosen, contemplative. The kind of being alone that leads to understanding rather than despair." Arthur wondered if that's how Iris saw him, someone whose solitude was philosophical rather than circumstantial, chosen rather than imposed. The interpretation was flattering, but it also felt incomplete. Webb had seen only what the painting showed, a figure in peaceful contemplation among the gravestones. He couldn't have known about the particular longing that had brought Arthur to the cemetery that afternoon, the way he sometimes walked there when the weight of loving Iris became too much to carry in the confines of his own garden. The phone rang, interrupting his reverie. Arthur glanced at the clock, nearly 7, and felt his pulse quicken with the hope that it might be Iris, calling to share more details about her triumph, or simply to maintain the connection that had felt so strong between them the night before. "Arthur? It's Miguel. From the literacy class." Arthur felt a small disappointment, followed immediately by concern. Miguel rarely called, and when he did, it usually meant he was struggling with something more complex than usual. "Miguel, hello. How are you doing?" "I'm okay, Mr. Arthur. I finished the book. Of Mice and Men. I read the whole thing, start to finish, and I wanted to tell someone who would understand what that means." The quiet pride in Miguel's voice made Arthur smile. "Miguel, that's wonderful. What did you think of it?" "It made me sad, but also, I don't know how to explain it. It made me feel like I understood something important about people. About how we need each other, even when we can't always take care of each other the way we want to." Arthur leaned back in his chair, moved by the thoughtfulness of Miguel's response. This was why he continued to volunteer with the literacy program. Moments like this, when reading opened doors not just to information, but to empathy, to a deeper understanding of the human condition. "That's exactly what Steinbeck was writing about," Arthur said. "The way people try to connect with each other, even in circumstances that make connection difficult." "Yeah. Like George and Lenny. They had each other, but they also didn't, you know. They were together, but still alone in some ways." The observation struck Arthur with particular force, coming as it did on the heels of his evening with Iris. Together but still alone in some ways. It was a perfect description of the complicated space they occupied, close enough to matter deeply to each other, but not close enough to bridge the gap between friendship and the more complex intimacy Arthur carried in secret. "You have a good understanding of the story," Arthur told Miguel. "What did you think about the ending?" They talked for another 20 minutes about George's impossible choice, about mercy and sacrifice, about the way love sometimes required letting go of the very thing you most wanted to protect. Miguel's insights were surprisingly sophisticated, and Arthur found himself genuinely engaged in the conversation, grateful for the distraction from his own complicated feelings. After they hung up, Arthur sat in his kitchen as full darkness settled over Millbrook Harbour. Through his window, he could see the distant lights of the harbour itself, the gentle sweep of headlights along Shore Road, the warm glow spilling from neighbors' windows. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of evening view that had drawn him and Eleanor to this town 35 years ago, when they were young and thought they had all the time in the world to figure out what happiness looked like. The phone rang again, and this time it was Iris. "Arthur. I'm so glad I caught you. How was the train ride home?" Her voice was bright with lingering excitement, and Arthur could hear city sounds in the background, traffic, voices, the particular urban energy of a Saturday night in Boston. Peaceful. It gave me time to process everything from last night. How are you feeling today? Like I'm living someone else's life, she said with a laugh. I keep expecting to wake up and find out it was all a dream. Claire called this morning to tell me that 2 more pieces sold after we left, and she wants to discuss representation. Arthur, she wants to represent my work. Arthur felt the familiar mixture of joy for her success and awareness of what that success might mean for their friendship. Gallery representation would mean more shows, more travel, more opportunities that would gradually pull Iris away from the quiet rhythms of coastal Maine. That's incredible news, Iris. You deserve all of this. I keep thinking about what you said, about how my work captures something true about living here, not just visiting. I think that's what people are responding to. The fact that I'm not painting postcards, I'm painting. I don't know. The feeling of belonging somewhere. The emotional architecture, Arthur said, remembering the gallery director's phrase. Exactly. Oh, Arthur, I can't wait to get home tomorrow and start working again. I have so many ideas, so much I want to explore. This whole experience has been like having my vision validated, you know. Like discovering that the way I see things actually matters to other people. She talked for several more minutes about her plans, about the painting she wanted to start as soon as she got back to her studio, about the strange surreal pleasure of seeing her work hanging in professional lighting. Arthur listened with genuine pleasure, warmed by her enthusiasm and grateful that she had chosen to share these moments with him. Arthur, she said as their conversation was winding down. Thank you again for being there last night. It meant everything to have someone in the room who really knows me, who's seen me doubt myself and struggle and finally find my way to this moment. It was my honor to witness it, Arthur said, and meant it completely. I'll see you tomorrow evening, okay? I'll probably get back around dinner time, and I'll want to hear all about what I missed in the harbor while I was off being a fancy artist. After she hung up, Arthur sat in his quiet kitchen and thought about witness and belonging, about the way people's lives intersected and diverged, creating temporary constellations of meaning before moving on to new configurations. Iris would return tomorrow, but she would be returning as someone slightly different, someone who had tasted success and found it good, someone whose horizons had expanded beyond the boundaries of their small coastal town. He was genuinely happy for her, Arthur realized. Beneath the complexity of his personal feelings, beyond the quiet grief of knowing that her success would inevitably create distance between them, he felt a pure and uncomplicated pleasure in her achievement. She had worked for this, deserved this, and the fact that it might change their friendship didn't diminish his joy in her recognition. Arthur made himself a simple dinner and ate it while reading the newspaper, catching up on the small dramas and celebrations that had unfolded in his absence. Mrs. Patterson's cat had been found after 3 days missing. The harbour master was retiring after 27 years. The Methodist Church was planning a harvest festival. The ordinary, ongoing life of a place where people knew each other's stories and cared about each other's small triumphs and defeats. It was a good life, Arthur thought as he prepared for bed. Different from what he might have imagined for himself at this stage, certainly more solitary than he had expected when he was younger. But good in its own way, rich with small connections and quiet satisfactions. He had his books, his volunteer work with Miguel and the other literacy students, his garden that would need preparing for winter in the coming weeks. He had the respect of his neighbors and the particular contentment that came from living in a place where he understood the rhythms and could read the weather signs in the color of the evening sky. And he had his friendship with Iris, whatever shape that friendship might take as her life expanded into new possibilities. Tomorrow she would return, full of stories and plans, and he would listen with the attention he had always given her, grateful for whatever part of her journey she chose to share with him. Some kinds of love, Arthur had learned, were best measured not in proximity or possession, but in the quality of witness offered, the faithfulness of attention maintained over time. He loved Iris in the way that steady ground loves the growing things it supports, not expecting reciprocation, not demanding acknowledgement, but offering the consistent presence that allows other forms of flourishing to take place. It was not the love he might have chosen if choice were the primary factor. But it was the love that circumstances had made possible, and Arthur had learned to find meaning in what was possible rather than mourning what was not. As he turned off the lights and made his way upstairs, Arthur could hear the distant sound of waves against the rocks at Gull Point, the eternal conversation between water and stone that provided the soundtrack for all their human dramas. Tomorrow Iris would return, and their friendship would continue in whatever form her new success required. Tonight, there was only the peaceful solitude of his own house, the October wind in the maples outside his window, and the quiet satisfaction of having played his small, but necessary part in someone else's moment of recognition. Epilogue, Spring Light. 6 months later, on an April morning when the harbor reflected the sky like hammered silver, Arthur stood in his garden planting the tomato seedlings he had started on his kitchen windowsill in February. The earth was finally warm enough, finally soft enough after the long Maine winter, and he worked with the particular satisfaction that comes from participating in spring's annual resurrection. Iris had been gone for 3 weeks now, back to Boston for what Claire Meridian called the next phase of her career development. There would be a summer show at a gallery in Kennebunkport, a possible exhibition in Portland in the fall, and what Iris described as more opportunities than I know what to do with. She called every few days, her voice bright with the energy of someone whose life had suddenly expanded beyond any boundaries she had previously imagined. Arthur had helped her load her car the morning she left, just as he had in October, but this time the packing had included more than supplies for a temporary trip. She had taken her favorite easel, her collection of reference books, enough clothes to last several months. The cottage next door now stood empty except for the few pieces of furniture too large to transport, and the ghost scent of turpentine that lingered in the air like a memory of creative work. "I'm not sure how long I'll be gone this time," she had told him as they stood in her driveway on the morning of her departure. "Maybe the whole summer, maybe longer. There's talk of a residency program, and Claire thinks I should establish myself in the Boston art scene while I have this momentum." Arthur had nodded, understanding both the professional logic and the personal cost of her decision. "You should follow where your work leads you. You've been so important to me, Arthur. I hope you know that. Having someone who believed in me when I was just starting to believe in myself, that made all the difference." She had hugged him then, a long embrace that smelled of coffee and determination and the particular sadness that comes with necessary goodbyes. Now, kneeling in his garden with dirt under his fingernails and the April sun warm on his back, Arthur found himself thinking about the different seasons of love, the way feelings could change form without changing essence. His love for Iris had evolved over the months since her first gallery opening, becoming something more complex, and paradoxically, more peaceful. He no longer tormented himself with impossible scenarios, or ached quite so sharply when he saw couples walking together along the harbor. Instead, he had learned to carry his feelings like a favorite book, something to be treasured, revisited occasionally, but not something that prevented him from engaging fully with the rest of his life. The literacy class had expanded to include 2 new students, Maria, a young mother from Guatemala who cleaned houses during the day and studied English at night, and Frank, a 70-year-old mechanic who had decided he wanted to read the novels his late wife had loved. Arthur found deep satisfaction in this work, in the patience it required and the small daily miracles of comprehension that rewarded persistence. Last week, Miguel had read his granddaughter a bedtime story for the first time, stumbling only occasionally over the unfamiliar words. "You gave me that," Miguel had told Arthur afterward. The ability to be part of her world in a new way. Arthur's own world had grown quieter since Iris's departure, but not smaller. He had started attending the Methodist Church's book discussion group, where he found himself in thoughtful conversations about everything from Marcus Aurelius to Alice Munro. He had volunteered to help with the library's oral history project, interviewing long-time residents about their memories of Millbrook Harbour in earlier decades. Mrs. Patterson, whose cat had been found safe the previous fall, had asked him to help her organize her late husband's papers, a task that had led to the discovery of a remarkable collection of photographs documenting the town's maritime history. These were modest engagements, Arthur knew, small acts of participation in the ongoing life of his community. But they had their own importance, their own way of creating meaning. He was learning that there were many ways to love the world, many forms that witness and attention could take. The phone rang as he was washing the garden soil from his hands at the kitchen sink. Arthur dried his fingers on a dish towel and answered, expecting to hear Miguel's voice, or perhaps Mrs. Patterson, with a question about the photograph project. Instead, he heard Iris, calling from Boston with news. "Arthur, I have something to tell you, and I wanted you to be the first to know. The gallery in New York, the one Claire has been talking to. They want to give me a solo show in September. A real New York show, Arthur. I can barely believe it." Her excitement was infectious, even across the telephone lines, and Arthur found himself genuinely smiling for the first time in weeks. "Iris, that's wonderful. That's everything you've worked for." "I know. And the crazy thing is, they specifically mentioned the cemetery painting, the one of you. They said it had what they called emotional resonance, that it captured something essential about solitude and contemplation. Arthur, your portrait is going to hang in a New York gallery." Arthur leaned against his kitchen counter, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Pride, certainly, and pleasure in Iris's success. But also something more complicated, the strange experience of learning that his private moment of grief and longing, translated through Iris's artistic vision, would become part of someone else's aesthetic experience. "I'm honored to have played a small part in your success," he said. "Not small," Iris said firmly. "Essential. You've been essential to all of this, Arthur. To my confidence, to my understanding of what it means to really see a place and the people in it. I couldn't have gotten here without you." They talked for another 20 minutes about logistics and timing, about the strange unreality of having one's work validated by institutions that had seemed impossibly distant just a year ago. Iris sounded different, Arthur noticed, not fundamentally changed, but expanded, more confident in her own voice and vision. Success had given her permission to take up space in the world in ways she had been too tentative to claim before. "When will you be back in Millbrook Harbour?" Arthur asked as their conversation was winding down. "I'm not sure," Iris said, and there was something careful in her voice, a delicate navigation around a subject that might cause pain. "There's so much happening here, So many opportunities one never imagined. Claire thinks I should consider relocating permanently, at least for a few years while I establish myself. And there's someone I've been seeing. Another artist. Someone who understands this world in ways that. She trailed off, perhaps recognizing the territory she was entering. That's wonderful, Arthur said, and was surprised to discover that he mostly meant it. You deserve to have all kinds of happiness in your life, Iris. Professional and personal. Arthur. Her voice was soft with genuine affection. You're one of the most generous people I know. I hope someday I can be half as gracious as you are. After they hung up, Arthur stood in his kitchen looking out at Iris's empty cottage, and felt something shift inside him, like tectonic plates settling into a new configuration. She would not be coming back, not in any permanent way. Boston had claimed her, or perhaps she had claimed Boston, claimed the life that her talent and hard work had made possible. There would be visits, certainly, brief returns to check on the cottage and maintain her connection to the landscape that had formed her artistic vision. But the daily presence, the shared rhythms of neighboring lives, the possibility of deeper intimacy, these were ending, if they had not already ended. Arthur waited for the devastation he expected to feel, the crushing weight of loss that had defined the first year after Eleanor's death. Instead, he felt something quieter and more complex, sadness, yes, but also a kind of peaceful completion. He had loved Iris well, in the way that circumstances had made possible. He had supported her work, celebrated her successes, provided the steady friendship she had needed during a period of transformation. If the story was ending differently than his secret heart had hoped, it was still ending with dignity and mutual respect, with genuine affection that would outlast physical proximity. Some loves, Arthur realized, were never meant to be possessed or consummated. Some loves existed to teach patience, to cultivate the ability to witness and appreciate without demanding reciprocation. His love for Iris had been one of these, a love that had made him more attentive to beauty, more aware of the courage it takes to create something new, more appreciative of the small daily gifts that make life meaningful. He would miss her, certainly. He would miss their conversations about books and painting, their shared observations about the changing light over the harbor, the comfortable silence that had developed between them over 2 years of friendship. But he would not regret having loved her, would not wish away the feelings that had complicated his life and ultimately enriched it. Arthur made himself a cup of coffee and carried it out to his back deck, where he could see the harbor spreading toward the horizon like a blue promise. The April afternoon was warm enough to sit outside, and he settled into the wooden chair Eleanor had given him for his 60th birthday, the one position to catch both the morning sun and the evening light. In a few hours, Miguel would arrive for his weekly tutoring session, eager to discuss the Raymond Carver stories Arthur had recommended. Tomorrow, Arthur would meet with Mrs. Patterson to continue organizing her husband's photographs, searching for images that might illuminate the town's maritime history. Over the weekend, he planned to visit the nursery in Camden to select perennials for the shaded corner of his garden where Eleanor's roses had never quite thrived. These were modest plans, ordinary pleasures. But they were his plans, his pleasures, and they carried their own quiet significance. Arthur had learned, over the course of his 67 years, that meaning came not from the magnitude of one's experiences, but from the quality of attention paid to them. Love was not diminished by being unrequited, art was not lessened by being appreciated rather than created, life was not impoverished by being lived quietly rather than dramatically. He sipped his coffee and watched a pair of gulls wheel over the harbor, their cries carrying on the salt-sweet wind that had become the soundtrack of his retirement years. Somewhere in Boston, Iris was probably preparing canvases for her New York show, translating her memories of this very light into pigment and vision. Somewhere in New York, a collector was living with Arthur's painted solitude, perhaps finding in it a reflection of his own relationship to loss and contemplation. The afternoon light was beginning to slant through the maple trees, casting long shadows across his garden where tomato seedlings waited to grow into summer's abundance. Arthur finished his coffee and went inside to prepare for Miguel's visit, selecting the right balance of challenging and accessible texts, arranging his small teaching materials on the kitchen table where they worked best together. This was his life now, small acts of cultivation and attention, modest contributions to other people's growth and understanding, quiet appreciation for beauty in all its forms. It was not the life he might have chosen at 25 or even 55, but it was the life that circumstances and character had created together, and Arthur had learned to find it good. Some stories, he had come to understand, were not about getting what you wanted but about learning to want what you had been given. Some loves were not about possession but about witness. Some solitudes were not empty but full of memory and possibility, of small daily choices to remain open to beauty, of the persistent faith that meaning could be found in even the most ordinary days. Outside his window, the harbour held the last light of afternoon like a cupped hand, and Arthur Pemberton prepared to spend another evening in the careful company of someone learning to read the world.